Hi, this is Jeff Altman, the Big Game Hunter, and you're either watching JobSearchTV.com or listening to This is No BS Job Search Advice Radio. I was a professional recruiter for more than 40 years, filled more than 1,200 full-time positions, plus consulting assignments. Now I coach people and help them land in new roles and a variety of other things in terms of being effective in the workplace. What I try to do from time to time is bring on an expert on some element of job search. And today I've got a good one on a topic that I don't cover with any regularity. His name is Steve Kahan. He's the CMO of Thycotic Software and has successfully helped grow 7 startup companies from early stage development to going public or being sold, resulting in a total value of more than, get this number, folks, $3 billion, and is the author of Be a Startup Superstar, Ignite Your Career Working at a Tech Startup. Steve, thanks for making time today. Great to have you on.
Great to be with you, Jeff.
Super. Now, here we are talking about startups, but what's your experience in non-startup lives? Did you start at one of those mind-numbing jobs at a mind-numbing firm that drove you into the arms of startups? What was your early story?
I did. And so, like so many of your listeners who might remember conversations with their parents, my father used to tell me so many times when I was growing up, he'd say, Steve, get your degree, go to work for a large corporation, you work hard, they'll take care of you, and you will have a great career. And then, of course, he would say, however, your mother and I would much prefer that you become a doctor or a lawyer, but short of that, getting a job at a large corporation will do. So that was the path I took. And right out of college, I went to work for a large corporation. And I remember about 1.5 years in, I opened up my bank statement. And once again, I was down to $50 in my bank account. I was 22 years old, working on the 4th floor of a nondescript office building in Schaumburg, Illinois. And I was staring at my bank statement and this pile of claims I was supposed to process that day. I was processing claims for a large organization and wondering how on earth would I ever get ahead. And I would work long days, and the student loans used to take a hold of my paychecks before they ever had a chance to hit my bank account. So on one day, I asked myself a very important question. And that was, how could I earn a great living and love the work I do? And what I quickly realized that working at the large Fortune 500 corporation that I was at was not going to be that place. And so it was on that day that I began researching startups and made my way into the startup world. And so I made a quick transition about 1 3/4 years in of processing claims, where I knew that that was not going to be the path that I would take, where I would accomplish the goals that I had set for myself.
It's amazing. I think we're generationally similar. And I know it gets passed on from generation to generation, that lie about job stability with the big company. And folks, if you haven't noticed, in the last major recession in 2008, 2009, the firms that were laying off the most people anywhere in the world were those big, large, allegedly stable organizations, right?
Absolutely. And since 1995, 65% of all new jobs have come from small and mid-sized businesses. And so that's really where a lot of the job growth is being fueled. And there's some amazingly fabulous opportunities out there right now.
No question about it. Now, there you were sitting at your desk doing claims work, and you said you did some research, found the idea of startups. And what was it about startups that was starting to appeal to you?
Well, first, let me define what a startup is, right? And so according to the United States Small Business Administration, they say that a startup is a company that has been in business for a year and is in the formative stages. But that actually paints such a poor picture for what defines a startup. And my friend Doug Irwin, who's chairman of a venture capital company and serial technology entrepreneur, he offers a far more instructive definition. He says a startup is a company that operates like it's the last frontier for outlaws, a place where nonconformists can live, create, and sell their ideas. And to me, that's so cool. I mean, who doesn't want to be involved in that? It's a place where you get to be the rough riding rebel running circles around the slow moving bureaucratic large corporations. And so first of all, a startup it's a culture, it's a mindset, it's working with typically a small team of crazies that are hell bent on changing the world. And so if you think about a large corporation compared to a startup, oftentimes those large corporations, they're burdened with incumbent mindsets. The barriers to advancement could be a little bit higher. You're oftentimes hired into more of a small, defined, often pigeonholed role. They're like giant ships, oftentimes hard to maneuver and slow to change course, where the status quo is accepted and there tends to be more bureaucracy. And compare that to a startup where rather than the large sort of ship, these are like the speedboats that are darting around those large ships, where there tends to be more innovation. They move fast, there's fast change. There's more risk to be sure, but if you're entrepreneurial, a startup is a place that you really ought to consider.
It's funny when you were describing the old-time firms, the established organizations, two thoughts came to mind. One was our environment in the Middle East, where we send in destroyers and other nations send in, speedboats, and who becomes more nimble and tends to be more of a headache? And the answer is, of course, the speedboat. And the other thing that came to mind was a situation that I was in some years ago when I was still doing headhunting, where my firm was acquired. I sold it, and I became an employee. Boy, I regretted that decision once again. And the owner of my old firm and the firm I was now joining was morbidly obese. And thus everything had to take more time because he needed to be able to control things because of his girth. And that's the way it feels in a large company, right?
Yeah, I mean, our company right now partners with some very large corporations. And what's interesting is these large corporations, first of all, oftentimes they have to go through such bureaucracy to get a deal done with a company like ours. And then you'll be in meetings with those people and they'll start out the meeting apologizing for, that's kind of how we are. And it's too bad that we're that way, but that's the way it is. And so you see some of that. And all you could think to yourself is, gee, I wonder if the CEO of that corporation, if they had a magic wand, if they might say, boy, I wish for just this month only, we could act more like a startup. How would that impact shareholder value? And I think it would be significant.
You betcha. And I always think of the classic example, and again, I'm going to use history and a story from technology, which was IBM and its desire to get out from underneath Microsoft, who at that time was the small, nimble provider of an operating system. And they decided to build their own called OS2. And folks, if you've never heard of OS2, there's a reason for it. It was built by committee. It had to go through 30 different layers of approval. It was, as they say in the trade, a dog. It was slow, cumbersome, awful, but they wanted to save money. And thus their thinking was, we can do this better than Microsoft, and they couldn't. Really that simple.
I remember OS2.
And it's, again, generationally, we're similar. So how do you find these opportunities with startups, and what do you tend to look for? What should someone tend to look for when they're starting to consider startup life?
First, let me talk about a couple of ways that might be unconventional that you might go look for a startup. Obviously, there's all the conventional ways, right? But one of the ways that if you are interested in a startup that you might go look for one right now would be this. If you go to Google and Google the term accelerator or perhaps technology accelerator in the city that you want to do a job search in, what you'll find is these accelerators basically fund a number of companies within the particular city that they're located. And so these accelerators and their portfolio companies that are a part of that typically will be searching for jobs from that accelerator's website. And nobody knows that, right? And so there tends to be lots of jobs across all functions that you can find from those accelerator websites, and then do your research of a number of really good startups in that particular city. And it's virtually every city across the United States of size that you will find those. So that would be one.
I want to pause for 1 second. And folks, he has one of those accents where I'm hearing accelerator with as though it was with an E, when in fact it's accelerator with an A. Am I correct?
That is correct.
Just making sure. And if you're not sure how to spell it from that point, just enter however you think it's spelled into Google. It figures it out for you. Thank you.
Yeah,
And I think that
my poor Midwestern accent, even though I live in Sugar Land, Texas, came out.
and I'm a Yankee who moved south as well, ex-New Yorker who's now in North Carolina. And I try and listen for my viewers and listeners to make sure that nothing goes wrong. And I think the most famous accelerator that I know of is Y Combinator.
Yeah, they're one of the biggest, and there are lots of them. Another way to go find great roles that are available today is bypassing the conventional channels. So for example, you're never going to find a startup. For example, my company Thycotic I've been there now 4.5 years. In 4 years, we went from 8 million to over 100 million. And so we're going through super rapid growth. And you'll never find us, although we're located in Washington, D.C., recruiting on campus at Georgetown or in Lawrence, Kansas at the University of Kansas, or pick your university of choice. It's not what the startups do. That's where the big boys go. And so I've had a number of people over the years look for jobs in this way. They will follow, for example, what I am writing about online through various social media channels. And then they'll be very innovative and contact me through social sites like LinkedIn Messenger. And they'll be very sincere, very heartfelt. You can't be salesy. And you'll oftentimes hear from people who are looking to not go through the traditional channels, who are interested in learning from those who have achieved the success that they want to be able to achieve. And they'll reach out, for example, to technology executives such as myself directly. And what you'll find is, don't be dissuaded if you don't get responses from all of the people that you might reach out to. You're dealing with busy people. But what you'll find more often than not is that these executives oftentimes realize that there are people that have helped them in their careers along the way, and they want to be able to pay it forward as well. And so long as you're sincere, you come across very much in a heartfelt approach, and then you gain a conversation, for example, with someone such as myself, and then transition that conversation back to you and how you might achieve similar results in your career, then you now have potentially opened up the opportunity for the great roles that might exist within that company or within that particular executive's network. So directly contacting executives, I think, is a great way to go find some fabulous opportunities that exist today.
I agree, by the way. And one of the cool things, folks, is that when you think about the classic complaint that job hunters have, it's about applying for jobs through the black hole. And thus, you're getting online. And the metaphor that I use, it's like uh, you're in a fish in a lake, and there's one hook that's thrown in, and everyone's trying to jump on. The other one is, of course, the big line. The line, of course, being to HR. And here, what you're trying to do, which is one of my favorite things to tell people to do, is cut the line. How do you get to the front of the line? And there is no line in startups. That's the cool thing about them. You're
Yeah.
able to get directly to people who make their own decisions. And you may not get hired because they may not have funding at this point. It may be the wrong timing and what have you, but you're getting to someone who can actually make the decision.
That's right. And if you look at the number one issue keeping CEOs up at night at startups, there was a recent survey, and it wasn't growing revenue, it wasn't acquiring customers, it wasn't gaining access to more capital, it was hiring good people. And so think of that, right? That was the number one issue keeping startup CEOs up at night, which just speaks to the amazing opportunities that exist right now.
So true. The entire country's that way right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then you mentioned the second part of your question was, once you've made the decision to join a startup, what do you look for? And so I've refined my criteria over the years. And I guess if I would have picked one or two good ones, maybe I just would have been flat out dumb luck. But because I've had six and now on my way to seventh great exit, I've learned a few things along the way. And here's what I look for. So the first thing that I look for when I join a startup are quality people who share my values, right? And so the people reflect a company's culture. And if you don't think you can respect, trust, and admire, particularly the startup executives involved, then you need to move on, right? And so what you're looking for is a solid team of leaders that rock your world. It's criteria number one.
I'm going to pause right there because that's a great one. And knowing, and this is one of the classic things I always point out when people talk about hiring for fit. Now I'm going to do it in the reverse. Everyone's on good behavior during interviews. Job hunters try and put on a good show. It took me a while when I first got into recruiting back in the Stone Ages to figure out that employers are too.
Yeah.
And thus, how do you figure out what's real and what's BS when they're doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I'll tell you the question that I ask to cut right through it. So this is a 301 level question. So for those of you listening, take out your pen. So this is the question that I would ask. If you weren't building your startup, what would you be doing? Right. And so that question it typically causes people to take a step back and to really think about it, but it begins to offer dialogue around what that person is interested in, what gets them excited beyond just simply the startup, where they start opening up to you. And then you really get a chance to learn what that person's all about, where they're typically letting their hair down a little bit and not just going through the formality of the interview.
I'm a believer, the goal is to get people off the script.
Exactly.
And on both sides, everyone's got a script. Now, I have no hair to let down. I'll just simply say, folks, what we're talking about here is so important in terms of getting people to reveal of themselves, because no matter what job you take, there's a risk involved. That's the big company, small company, startup. There's always a risk. And where you can learn something about the person you'll be working for, it allows you to feel more comfortable and trusting stepping into the role. Great tip there.
Without a doubt. The second thing I look for is a concept that fills a big market need. And what we're talking about here is really, it's from two sides of the coin. First of all, is that when you go to work for a startup, you have to realize that most customers don't spend money on nice to solve problems. They spend money on must solve problems. And so what you're looking for is a market in which the product that the company sells actually ties into a must solve problem. What that means is that you've actually done a little bit of research to find out more about the business problems that the product specifically solves, and is this an urgent priority? So that would be one side of the equation. The second is you're looking for a large enough market, right? And there's tons of research. Google is a wonderful thing where you can find analyst reports or influencers that will write about a particular market. So you can make sure that there's enough runway within that market that a startup actually has a chance. And by the way, don't be dissuaded if you see that there's lots of competitors. In fact, it's sometimes quite the opposite. Be dissuaded if you see there's no competitors, because perhaps that might suggest that there's not a market.
Billions of people have lived on this planet. Every idea that's worth anything, it's almost all of them have already been created. We're looking for a proof of concept, in effect, that there is a market. And it may not be done correctly or as well as it could, or it may not have been marketed well, but the idea is to find that there is a market rather than create one, right?
Right. Then the third thing I really look for a few. The next thing is that that it's a great product or service that you believe in, right? And so at the end of the day, does that product or service resonate with you? Would you purchase it and recommend it? And you want to choose a startup where you just have this driving passion around what the company is creating, and in particular, your role in creating it. And I don't mean that necessarily that you have to be a techie or a coder. I've been in technology my whole career, and I can't code a single line. But in your role in creating it is selling it or marketing it or running finance or HR, whatever that might be, you've got an important role. And so that enthusiasm and passion absolutely must be there. And then finally, that the startup is well funded. And so naturally, you want to choose a startup that has a long enough runway to get off the ground. And so before you take the job, you want to make sure that it's properly capitalized so you have the best chance at growth and stability.
So it begs the question of, how does someone make that determination? They say, we've gotten our Series A, we've raised X number of dollars, and we want to bring on someone to join us early on, yada, yada, yada. We're well capitalized.
So I'm now going to share. So this is time to take out your pen once more.
Ooh.
So now I'm going to share the other questions that I ask, right? And this is formulated over 30 years. And so these are the questions that I ask a startup when I join them. So I gave you one already. So let me tell you the questions to ask. So the next question that I would ask beyond what I gave you is, why is now the time for your company to exist? Another one, what milestones has your company achieved? Another, what do you love about your team, and why are you the ones to solve this problem? Another, tell me about your first paying customer or a paying customer, and what was their journey? How did you find them? What are your revenue expectations for them over the next year? Another, and this gets at the point that you raised, is how much has your company raised and what's its runway? Don't shy away from being very, very explicit on that question. And then another question that I would ask that also gets at the funding are, who are your investors and why did you choose them?
Excellent.
And so if you ask those questions, not only will you have a great sense of where that company actually is, but you will also significantly differentiate yourself in the process, because I can assure you, nobody else going up for the same role will be asking questions like these.
They're going to treat it like they're job hunting in the traditional sense of the term. So they ask all the predictable questions that a job hunter might ask. And digging deeper is a differentiator.
Absolutely. And these are the dig deep questions that yield great answers. And then there's follow-ups every time, right?
And,
And so,
and I want
and
to check on I want to check on runway. And what should you be listening for when you hear the answer about their runway?
well, when you ask about runway, you could be asking questions like, well, what's the company's burn rate, right? And what they're talking about there is, what are the expenses on a monthly basis, quarterly basis, annual basis, and how does that compare to the revenue that's coming in vis-a-vis the cash that's on hand, right? That basically, and the potential for getting more if it is required, right? And not all startup executives will have it all figured out, right? I mean, oftentimes what you want to make sure is that the answers are good enough that you yourself feel comfortable with the level of risk, because there's always risk. As you've mentioned, Jeff, even in the largest of organizations where they might have a ton of cash, but they could have a crappy quarter, for example, and then decide they've got to cut expenses no matter how much cash they have. And then all of a sudden, you could be part of that. And that's what big companies do every day. And one of the most important reasons why I ask these questions, and one of the things that makes startups so cool in my view, is that many of them, not all, offer you the ability to get stock options. And let me tell you why that is so important in my view.
Speaking from personal experience.
Absolutely, right? And so, it is this. When you make an investment, say in the stock market, and you could do great research, right? And so perhaps you're fantastic at this. And at the end of the day, you really only know so much about the company. And I would guarantee you, you know virtually nothing about the CEO, for example, or the management team, in spite of all of the great research that you've done. But at a startup, I've always viewed it as betting on myself and the team that I work with. And the reason why that's so important is this, is as you grow older in your career and you gain more success, you're going to make more money. And then a funny thing happens. And that funny thing is, you get married, you buy a house, you go on vacations, you get a car. And what I'm saying is, your expenses go up just as much as your compensation goes up. And for the most diligent of savers, it's still hard to get ahead. But it's the stock options. If you make the right choice, you follow some of the guidelines that I've given that I look for, you pick the right ones, and then you get stock options, particularly if you're early on and you're fortunate enough for those to pay off for you. That's how you could create separation for yourself financially. And so for me, I've always viewed that the best investment that I make is on me and the team that I'm working for. And I know what's going on the inside, right? And and those are the investments I love to make. And so to me, that's how I view the importance of stock options. And I guess another reason why startups, at least in my view, are organizations many people ought to consider as they take their career forward.
Thank you. I want to check one thing with you, if I may. Have you been in a situation where you're doing great work, you're in a startup environment, but you left before the official exit time? That is, the firm wasn't acquired, the firm didn't go public. And if so, what prompted you to leave under those circumstances?
Well, for me, I did that once. Right. And so for me, it was more of a situation where I was pretty much vested with uh, almost all of my stock. Actually, I believe it was all. I have to think back in my career. So, of course, then I had to purchase those stock options.
Mhm.
And so, which I did. And then the company actually exited about a year later. So it worked out great. But the reason why I moved on, quite frankly, at that point was I had the opportunity to work in a role that I had never done before, helping to lead a public company that was in rapid growth mode, and quite frankly, the compensation was just crazy, just in terms of what they decided that they would offer, and for me that was part of it. And the other part of it was taking on a team of 155 people in the marketing organization around the globe, and that was something I had never experienced. So it was a situation that I did where I actually left, and I was working with such close friends on the management team. It was such a hard decision to make, and it ripped me apart inside and out. And in fact, the CEO of that company is still one of my mentors to this date. And I actually sat down with that CEO and went through with him the pros and cons of my scenario. And he basically concluded, Steve, we're like family, but I can't stand in your way. And so it was just one of those scenarios. I'm always one of those people who believes stick things through. I think that people oftentimes view the grass as greener, and it is not. And
Absolutely
so
true.
I think there's a motto that I live by, which is hold on 1 second longer than the next guy, which is based on a mentor of mine who was a college wrestler that I learned. And I have applied that lesson and tried my very best to never leave early unless the company was um, maybe doing something unethical or illegal, or where it wasn't just the dealings of the way life is, that some days you have good days, some days you have bad days, that there was really a big reason for me to go. Sticking with things and through things and having the persistence and tenacity is one of the characteristics of startup people who achieve great success. And I think that persistence and tenacity is an overlooked attribute that people need to pay more attention to for themselves.
And, I think a lot of people think working for a startup is for when you're 22 rather than 32, 42, 52, or 62. I know that isn't true. And there's different levels of risk that people experience. Like you said, you get to a point where you got the house, you got the kids, there's only one income in the house. There's the feeling of a certain amount of pressure. And that pressure is going to exist in the big company too, folks. So it doesn't matter whether it's startup or big company, you're going to deal with that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And then what if you have your heart set in maybe getting into the C-suite? And so if you're working in the Fortune 500, I've got two words for you.
Good luck.
Yeah, good luck. Exactly. And that's because there can only be 500 CEO positions, maybe 5,000 in the C-suite all told. And many of these people stay in their jobs for years. And that means your odds of getting in the C-suite in the Fortune 500 are about the same as your odds of being drafted into the National Football League, where 254 players are selected in each year's NFL draft. Compare that to the 46,000 startups in the United States alone, and you could see there are far more executive leadership opportunities.
Absolutely true. Excuse me for laughing, folks, but it's a funny comment, you got to admit. Steve, thank you for making time. How can people find out more about you, be a startup superstar? whatever else you want to tell them about. And is your firm hiring right now in early 2020? And how can they find out about that too?
Yeah, so first of all, you could contact me at my website, which is www.beastartupsuperstar.com. My book, Be a Startup Superstar, is available on that site or wherever books are sold online. And yes, my company, Thycotic, is hiring today. We're hiring all around the globe. We are growing like a weed. And so we're one of those many, many thousands of startups that are desperate for hiring. And it's a wonderful cybersecurity company.
Terrific. And by the way, I'll have a link to the book in the notes, the show notes. It'll be an Amazon link, so feel free to order it there or through Steve's link. Steve, thank you. And folks, we'll be back soon with more. I'm Jeff Altman, the Big Game Hunter. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you're watching on YouTube, click the like button. Subscribe to my channel on YouTube by clicking the small icon in the lower right or the picture of me in the upper left. You'll get notified whenever I release something new. If you're listening to it in podcast form, subscribe. No BS Job Search Advice Radio. Great show, 7 days a week. Episode 1700 came out recently. It's the #1 podcast in Apple Podcasts for job search by far. And if you're interested in one-on-one coaching, reach out to me through my website, which is thebiggamehunter.us. In addition to all the great content in the blog there are buttons throughout the site where you can schedule time for a free discovery call or schedule time for coaching. And folks, hope you have a great day. Take care.